The stadium was packed. The lights were blinding. And Freddie Mercury stood at the center of the stage, ready to give another unforgettable performance. But that night, something happened that had nothing to do with music charts, applause, or fame. From the front row, Freddie noticed a small figure, fragile, pale, holding a handmade sign with trembling hands. A child, bald from chemotherapy, smiling with a courage far bigger than their body. In that moment, the greatest showman in rock history froze. What followed was not planned, not rehearsed, not written in any set list. It was a raw, human moment that silenced thousands and revealed a side of Freddie Mercury the world rarely saw. Before this story ends, you will discover why Freddie stopped the concert, what he whispered to the child on stage, and how one single encounter changed everyone in that stadium forever. This is one of the most emotional, forgotten moments of Freddie Mercury's life, and it will stay with you long after the final note. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Freddie Mercury. The year was 1986, and Queen was deep into a tour that felt both triumphant and exhausting. Stadiums sold out in minutes. Radios played their songs on endless repeat. To the world, Freddie Mercury appeared unstoppable, a force of nature wrapped in leather, confidence, and unmatched charisma. But beneath the lights, beneath the mustache and the commanding presence, something quieter had begun to settle inside him. Fatigue, not just physical exhaustion, but an emotional weight he rarely acknowledged. Night after night, he gave everything on stage, leaving little for himself when the lights went down. And yet, when the roar of the crowd hit him, something always reignited. The stage was where he felt most alive and most protected. That night, the stadium buzzed with anticipation. Tens of thousands of voices blended into a single thunderous sound as Freddie stepped into the spotlight. The opening notes rang out, and instantly, the crowd was his. He moved with precision and flair, his voice soaring effortlessly, his body language radiating authority and joy. But halfway through the set, something caught his eye. At the very front of the crowd, near the barricade, stood a small figure, far smaller than the others surrounding them. Freddie noticed the stillness first. While everyone else jumped, clapped, and screamed, this child stood quietly, holding a hand-painted sign above their head with visible effort. Freddie squinted, tried to read it between verses. "I'm fighting cancer. You're my hero." The words hit him harder than any applause ever had. For a brief moment, Freddie faltered, just slightly, missing a cue only Brian May noticed. His voice recovered instantly, but his eyes never left the child. Under the harsh white lights, he could see the pale skin, the thin arms, the head covered not by hair but by a soft cap pulled low. The child smiled, not the loud, careless smile of a concert-goer, but something gentler, braver, a smile that carried pain and hope at the same time. Freddie's chest tightened. He had seen many fans. Millions, in fact. He had waved, pointed, blown kisses, flirted with entire stadiums at once. But this was different. This wasn't adoration. This was survival reaching out to joy, a child standing at the edge of life, asking for a moment of magic. He sang through the rest of the song, but his mind drifted. Memories surfaced uninvited. Hospital corridors he walked through with friends, illnesses whispered about in hushed tones, fear hidden behind laughter. Freddie pushed the thoughts away, as he always did. The show went on. Yet every time he crossed the stage, his gaze returned to the child. The sign lowered now, arms clearly tired. A woman stood behind them, likely the mother, one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder, eyes shining with unshed tears. Freddie felt something crack open inside him. Between songs, the crowd erupted in cheers. Freddie approached the microphone, smiling, playing the part they expected. "You're quite loud tonight," he teased, drawing laughter and applause. Then his eyes drifted forward again. Without planning it, without asking permission from anyone, Freddie raised his hand slightly. The band quieted. The stadium hushed. Freddie leaned forward, peering into the crowd. "There's someone here tonight," he said slowly, his voice unusually soft, "who came with more courage than most of us ever will." A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. Freddie stepped closer to the edge of the stage. His gaze locked onto the child. "You," he said gently. "Yes, you with the sign." Gasps spread to the front rows. The child froze, eyes wide, unsure if this was real. The mother's hand tightened on their shoulder. Freddie crouched slightly, lowering himself to their level. "What's your name, darling?" The child hesitated, then spoke, their voice barely audible, but picked up by the nearby microphone. "Daniel." The name echoed through the speakers. Freddie smiled, not his usual mischievous grin, but something warmer, more vulnerable. "Well, Daniel," he said softly, "I think you're the bravest person in this entire stadium." The crowd reacted instantly. Applause swelled. Some cheered. Others wiped their eyes. Daniel's smile widened, trembling. Freddie stood slowly, placing a hand over his heart. "Would you like to come up here with me?" The stadium erupted. Security froze. Crew members exchanged panicked looks. This was not planned. This was not protocol. But Freddie Mercury had already decided. The mother's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Security carefully lifted Daniel over the barricade. The child clutched the sign tightly, steps unsteady as they were guided toward the stage. Freddie watched, heart pounding, not from performance adrenaline, but from something far more human. As Daniel reached the stage, Freddie knelt again, opening his arms without hesitation. Daniel stepped forward, slowly, and leaned into him. Freddie wrapped his arms around the child. The stadium went silent. In that embrace, the rock god disappeared. There was no legend, no icon, no performer. Only a man holding a child who refused to stop believing in joy. Freddie whispered something into Daniel's ear, words no microphone captured. And whatever he said made Daniel laugh. But what no one realized, not yet, was that this moment would change Freddie Mercury just as much as it changed that child. And what was about to happen next would leave the entire stadium in tears. The moment Daniel stepped onto the stage, time seemed to slow. The roar of the stadium faded into a low, distant hum, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Freddie Mercury remained kneeling, one hand resting gently on the child's back, the other still clutching the microphone that now felt strangely heavy. Daniel's arms were thin, fragile, yet they held Freddie with surprising strength, as if letting go might make the moment disappear. Freddie felt the child's heartbeat through the fabric of his jacket, fast and determined. It struck him then, with quiet force, how small Daniel was, how light, and how unfair it was that someone so young had already learned the way to fear. Freddie stood slowly, keeping one hand on Daniel's shoulder, guiding him carefully to the center of the stage. The lights softened as if sensing the shift. Brian May glanced over from his guitar. Confusion etched across his face, but when he saw the child, his expression changed. Roger Taylor lowered his drumsticks. John Deacon stopped playing altogether. The music died. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred. Freddie turned toward the crowd, Daniel still beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Freddie said, his voice calm but unusually unguarded, "this is Daniel." Applause erupted, not the wild, thunderous kind, but something gentler, respectful, loving. Daniel waved shyly, clutching the sign to his chest now, as if it were armor. Freddie noticed the way the child's knees trembled and instinctively placed a steadying hand behind Daniel's back. "You see," Freddie continued, glancing down at him, "Daniel came here tonight fighting a battle most of us can't even imagine." Freddie paused. The words caught slightly in his throat. "And yet," he added softly, "he's standing here smiling." The crowd responded with a wave of emotion. Cheers mixed with sobs, hands raised not in celebration but in solidarity. Daniel looked up at Freddie, eyes wide. "I like your songs," he said quietly. Freddie laughed, a soft, genuine laugh that melted the tension. "Well, darling, I like your courage." The band members watched in silence. None of this was rehearsed. None of it was safe in the world of massive tours and rigid schedules. But no one dared interrupt. Freddie crouched again so they were eye level. "Daniel," he asked gently, "do you know why we sing?" Daniel shrugged. "Because it makes people happy?" Freddie smiled sadly. "Yes," he said, And sometimes because it reminds us we're still alive. The words lingered in the air. Freddie stood and turned to the band. He gave Brian a look, not commanding, not dramatic, but asking. Brian hesitated only a second before nodding. Roger tapped his sticks together softly. John adjusted his bass. Freddie turned back to Daniel. "Would you like to hear a song?" he asked. Daniel nodded eagerly. "My favorite." Freddie raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and which one is that?" Daniel swallowed. "Somebody to Love." A hush swept through the stadium. Freddie felt a strange tightening in his chest. Of all the songs, of all the lyrics. He glanced at Brian again, who nodded once more, slower this time, understanding the weight of the choice. Freddie took Daniel's small hand in his and led him to the piano. He sat down, adjusting the bench so Daniel could sit beside him. The child's feet didn't reach the floor. Freddie noticed and felt something twist inside him. As his fingers touched the keys, Freddie hesitated. For the first time that night, he wasn't thinking about pitch or performance or control. He was thinking about fragility, about time, about the unspoken truth that life did not play fair. He began to play. The opening chords of Somebody to Love floated gently into the stadium, slower than usual, softer, stripped of grandeur. Freddie sang the first line quietly, almost as if singing to himself. "Can anybody find me somebody to love?" Daniel watched him, eyes shining. As the song continued, the crowd joined in, not shouting, not overpowering, but whispering the lyrics like a shared prayer. Thousands of voices blended into one fragile harmony. Freddie glanced at Daniel mid-song. "This one's for you," he said. Daniel smiled, but then something unexpected happened. The child's smile wavered. Daniel's hand tightened around Freddie's sleeve. His breathing changed, shallow, uneven. Freddie noticed instantly. Years of instinct kicked in. He stopped playing. "What is it, darling?" Freddie asked quietly. Daniel shook his head, tried to smile again, but his face had gone pale beneath the lights. "I feel dizzy," Daniel whispered. The crowd fell silent again. Freddie stood immediately, kneeling in front of him, blocking the lights with his body. "It's all right," he said calmly, though his heart began to race. "Just breathe with me." The mother rushed forward from the wings. Panic etched across her face. A medic followed close behind. Freddie kept his hand on Daniel's back, whispering softly, nonsense words, comforting sounds, anything to keep the child grounded. The stadium watched, frozen. The rock star was gone. The showman was gone. There was only a man kneeling on a stage, holding a sick child, praying silently that the moment would not turn into tragedy. As the medics carefully lifted Daniel, Freddie stood, hands trembling slightly. He leaned into the microphone one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, "this is what strength looks like." The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in tears. Daniel was carried off stage, his small hand lifting weakly in farewell. Freddie watched until the wings swallowed them whole. He turned slowly back toward the piano, and for the first time that night, he realized something profound had shifted inside him. This was no longer just a concert. This was a reckoning. And what Freddie would do next would change the meaning of that song forever. The curtain closed slowly, not with drama, but with a heavy finality that felt wrong for a Queen concert. Backstage, the air was thick with urgency. Medics moved swiftly, their voices low and controlled, guiding Daniel onto a stretcher beneath the harsh white lights of the corridor. Freddie Mercury followed closely, his long stride suddenly uncertain, his usual confidence stripped away with the music. He hovered near the medics, hands clenched at his sides, watching Daniel's small chest rise and fall unevenly. The child's mother clutched her purse with white knuckles, her eyes darting between Daniel and Freddie, as if afraid the moment might shatter if she blinked. "Is he going to be okay?" Freddie asked quietly. It was the first time anyone backstage had heard that tone from him. Not commanding, not playful, not ironic. Just a man asking a question he wasn't ready to hear the answer to. One of the medics glanced up briefly. "He's exhausted." The lights, the noise, the excitement. It was a lot for his body. Freddie nodded, swallowing hard. "Aren't we all?" he murmured. They moved Daniel into a small medical room. Freddie stopped at the doorway, uncertain. This was not his world. He belonged on stages, not in spaces that smelled of antiseptic and fear. And yet, something pulled him forward. Daniel's eyes fluttered open. "Did I mess it up?" the child whispered weakly. Freddie crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt beside the bed. "No," he said immediately. "You made it unforgettable." Daniel smiled faintly. The mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Thank you for seeing him. He's been in hospital for months." Tonight was the first time he felt like a normal kid. Freddie's chest tightened. Normal. The word echoed louder than any applause. He thought of his own childhood. The feeling of never quite fitting, of learning early how to perform confidence, so no one would see the doubt underneath. Daniel reached for Freddie's hand. Freddie took it without hesitation. "Did you mean it?" Daniel asked. "When you said I was brave?" Freddie held the child's gaze. "I meant every word," he said softly. "Bravery isn't being loud. It's showing up when you're afraid." Daniel nodded slowly, as if committing the idea to memory. Outside the room, the band waited. Brian leaned against the wall, arms crossed, concern etched into his face. Roger paced back and forth, drumming his fingers against his thigh. John stood quietly, staring at the floor. "This is serious," Roger whispered. "The crowd's waiting." Brian glanced toward the medical room. So is Freddie. Minutes stretched. The stadium buzzed with uncertainty. Whispers rippled through the audience. The lights remained dim. No one knew if the show would continue. Inside the room, Freddie sat beside Daniel, time suspended. For once, he didn't feel the need to rush, to perform, to fill the silence. He felt present in a way that surprised him. A nurse entered softly. "We're going to take him to the hospital for observation." Daniel's grip tightened around Freddie's fingers. "Will you finish the song?" he asked. Freddie hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He looked at the child, at the courage flickering behind tired eyes. "Yes," Freddie said firmly, "but only if you promise me something." Daniel nodded. "You keep fighting," Freddie continued. "And when you're stronger, you come see us again. Front row. Deal." Daniel smiled, a real smile this time. "Deal." As they wheeled Daniel away, Freddie stood frozen in the hallway, watching until the stretcher disappeared around the corner. A strange heaviness settled over him. He had sung about love, pain, and longing his entire life, but this moment had cut deeper than any lyric he'd ever written. Brian approached quietly. "You all right?" Freddie exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know what we have to do." He turned toward the stage. When Freddie stepped back into the spotlight, the stadium erupted, not with excitement, but with relief. The crowd sensed something had changed. Freddie approached the microphone slowly, his movements measured, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. "We're going to finish the show," he said, "but not the way we planned." He glanced back at the piano. "This next song is for Daniel, and for anyone fighting a battle we can't see." The band followed his lead. The opening notes of "Somebody to Love" filled the air again, but this time, something was different. Freddie sang not to impress, not to dominate, but to connect. His voice cracked just once. No one cared. The crowd sang with him, louder than before, carrying the melody together. Thousands of strangers united by a single moment of shared humanity. As the song ended, Freddie stood still, hands resting on the piano, eyes closed. And in that silence, he realized something that unsettled him deeply. That child had seen him, not as a legend, not as a star, but as a human being. And somehow, Freddie had never felt more exposed. The applause washed over him, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a question, one he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. When the final note faded and the applause finally settled into a distant roar, Freddie Mercury stood motionless at the piano. The stage lights washed over him, warm and blinding, yet he felt colder than he had in years. The crowd believed they had just witnessed an unforgettable performance, and they were right, but none of them could feel the heaviness now pressing against his chest. As the band exited the stage, Freddie followed more slowly than usual. His steps lacked their familiar swagger. Backstage, the noise returned in waves, voices, radios crackling, crew members rushing to reset equipment. But Freddie moved through it all like a ghost. Brian caught up to him near the dressing rooms. "That was something," he said carefully. "You didn't have to do that." Freddie stopped walking. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did." Brian searched his face, recognizing the tone. This wasn't defiance. It was resolve. In Freddie's dressing room, the door closed softly behind him. The familiar space, mirrors lined with lights, costumes hanging neatly, makeup scattered across the counter, suddenly felt foreign. He stared at his reflection. The mustache, the eyeliner smudged from sweat, the confident posture that usually returned the stare. Tonight, it didn't. Instead, he saw Daniel's face. Pale, smiling, brave. Freddie sat down heavily, elbows resting on his knees. For the first time in a long while, he let the silence stretch without filling it with humor or noise. He felt exposed, not because the audience had seen him cry, but because the moment with that child had stripped away the illusion he'd carefully built. The illusion that he was untouchable. A knock came at the door. "Freddie?" Roger's voice. "Hospital just called." Freddie stood instantly. "And he's stable," Roger said. "They're keeping him overnight. His mom wanted you to know he keeps talking about the song." Freddie closed his eyes, relief flooding through him, followed immediately by something heavier. Guilt. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." Roger hesitated. "You okay?" Freddie smiled faintly. "I've been better." Roger left him alone again. Freddie turned back to the mirror. His reflection stared back, waiting. He thought about all the songs he had written about longing, love, and pain, metaphors layered over truths he rarely confronted directly. But Daniel hadn't needed metaphors. He had needed presence, honesty, humanity. Freddie picked up the microphone resting on the table, turning it in his hands. How many times had this object made him feel powerful? Invincible? Tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like a responsibility. The show resumed, but Freddie carried the moment with him through every note. The laughter returned. The flamboyance reappeared. The crowd cheered. Yet beneath it all, a question followed him relentlessly. What happens after the applause? After the final bow? After the lights dimmed? After the audience went home? What did any of it mean if people like Daniel were fighting battles far greater than fame or music? Hours later, the stadium emptied. Trucks were loaded. The band gathered briefly, exhausted but quiet. No one mentioned the moment on stage. Not because it wasn't important, but because it felt too sacred to dissect casually. Back at the hotel, Freddie couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, city lights flickering below like distant stars. He replayed the scene over and over, Daniel's hand in his, the child's fragile voice asking if he'd messed it up, the look in the mother's eyes. He had spent his life being adored by millions, yet one child had reached him in a way none of the others ever had. Near dawn, the phone rang. Freddie answered instantly. "It's Daniel's mother," the voice said softly. "He wanted to speak to you." There was a pause. Then a familiar, tired voice came through the line. "Hi, Freddie." Freddie swallowed hard. "Hello, superstar." Daniel laughed weakly. "They said I was very brave." Daniel said, "But I was scared." Freddie leaned against the wall, eyes closing. "So was I," he admitted, "terrified." There was silence, not awkward, but understanding. "Will you remember me?" Daniel asked quietly. The question pierced him deeper than any criticism or rumor ever could. "Always," Freddie said without hesitation. "I promise." After the call ended, Freddie stood still for a long time, the weight of that promise settling into his bones. Promises were easy to sing about, harder to keep. Days later, letters began arriving, fans who had been there that night, parents, survivors, nurses, people sharing stories of illness, hope, loss. They all spoke of that moment as something bigger than music. Freddie read every letter. Each one chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself. He began visiting hospitals quietly while on tour. No cameras, no press. Just time. Songs hummed softly. Conversations without spotlights. He never spoke publicly about it, but something inside him had shifted permanently. Daniel had reminded him of something essential. That music wasn't just escape. It was connection, and with that realization came a quiet fear. If he allowed himself to feel this deeply, what else would he be forced to confront? As Freddie stared out at another unfamiliar city from another hotel window, a thought settled in his mind. Unsettling, undeniable. Some moments don't just change a night. They change a life. And Freddie Mercury was only beginning to understand the cost. The letter arrived folded twice, its edges worn as if it had been opened and closed many times before finally being sent. Freddie Mercury recognized the handwriting instantly. He was sitting at the small table in his hotel suite, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him when he picked it up. The room was quiet, unusually so, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the page. It was from Daniel. The child's words were uneven, clearly written with effort, but every line carried a weight that pressed hard against Freddie's chest. Daniel wrote about the hospital room with its pale walls and humming machines. He wrote about how the nurses teased him for singing too loudly. He wrote about how, when the nights were long and frightening, he thought about standing on that stage, about the lights, the piano, and Freddie's voice wrapping around him like a blanket. Near the bottom of the page, one sentence stopped Freddie cold. "When I'm scared, I remember you said bravery is showing up, so I try to show up every day." Freddie set the letter down slowly. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, blinking hard. He had sung to crowds his entire life. Written lyrics meant to last forever, yet nothing he'd ever created felt as heavy as that single line. He realized then that what had happened on that stage hadn't ended with the applause. It had followed him, quietly, relentlessly. Later that night, during sound check in another city, Freddie stood alone on stage while the crew adjusted lights and microphones. The empty arena echoed with hollow footsteps and distant chatter. He sat at the piano and pressed a single key, letting the sound linger. He thought of Daniel's question, "Will you remember me?" Freddie had answered without hesitation. Always, but promises he knew demanded action. That evening's show went on as planned. The crowd roared. Freddie dazzled, yet something subtle had changed. He spoke more between songs. He lingered at the edge of the stage. He looked at faces, really looked, instead of seeing them as a single blurred devotion. After the show, as the band gathered backstage, Brian noticed it first. "You've been different lately," he said carefully. Freddie smiled faintly. "Have I?" "Yes," Brian replied. "In a good way, but also like something's weighing on you." Freddie didn't deflect with humor this time. He nodded. "There's a child," he said simply. Brian didn't ask for more. He understood enough. Weeks passed. Letters from Daniel continued. Some were cheerful. Some were shorter, shakier. Freddie read each one the moment it arrived, carrying them folded carefully in his jacket pocket on show days, as if they were talismans. Then one night, a letter didn't come. Days passed. Silence. Freddie told himself not to panic. Children got tired. Hospitals were busy. But familiar unease settled in his chest, tightening with each passing day. Finally, the phone rang in the early hours of the morning. Freddie answered immediately. It was Daniel's mother. Her voice was steady, but only because it had already been broken too many times. She told Freddie that Daniel's condition had worsened. The treatments were no longer working as they'd hoped. Daniel had asked for one thing. "He wants to see you," she said quietly. "He doesn't know if he'll get another chance." Freddie closed his eyes. The world seemed to tilt slightly, as if searching for balance. Tours had schedules, contracts, expectations, but none of that mattered now. "I'll come," Freddie said. "Tell him I'm coming." The decision was immediate. Unquestioned, Freddie rearranged flights, canceled appearances, and slipped away without announcement. No press, no cameras, just a man keeping a promise. The hospital room was smaller than Freddie had imagined. Dim, quiet. Daniel lay in the bed, thinner now, his smile softer but unmistakable when Freddie entered. "You came," Daniel whispered. Freddie sat beside him, taking his hand gently. "I told you I would." They talked for hours, about music, about dreams, about silly things. Freddie sang softly, barely above a whisper, his voice filling the small room with warmth. Nurses paused outside the door. The mother watched with tears in her eyes. At one point, Daniel looked at Freddie very seriously. "Are you scared?" he asked. Freddie hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Daniel squeezed his hand. "It's okay," he said. "You showed me how to be brave. Now I can help you." Freddie felt something break open inside him, not painfully, but honestly. When Freddie left that night, he kissed Daniel's forehead and whispered goodbye. He didn't know it was the last time. The call came 2 days later. Daniel was gone. Freddie sat alone when he received the news. He didn't cry immediately. He simply sat, holding the last letter Daniel had written, feeling the weight of a life far too short, and the impact it had made on his own. At the funeral, Freddie stood quietly at the back, unrecognized, unnoticed. He placed a single white rose near the casket and left without speaking. But he didn't leave unchanged. From that day forward, Freddie Mercury carried Daniel with him, not as sorrow, but as purpose. He began donating quietly, visiting hospitals, writing letters, singing not just for crowds, but for those who needed hope more than spectacle. And yet, as the years passed, another truth loomed, one Freddie could no longer ignore. Daniel had taught him how precious time was. And now, faced with his own fragile mortality, Freddie would soon be forced to confront a truth that would test that lesson in ways he never imagined, because the next battle would be his own. Freddie Mercury stood alone in his bathroom, the early morning light filtering weakly through the curtains. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears and left no room to hide from one's thoughts. He stared at his reflection, studying the familiar face as if seeing it for the first time. The mustache was there, the sharp cheekbones, the eyes that had stared down stadiums without blinking. But something had changed. Daniel's death lingered in Freddie's mind like an unfinished melody, repeating itself no matter how hard he tried to drown it out. He had buried friends before. He had lost people quietly, painfully. But this loss felt different. It had cracked something open inside him, something he had spent his life protecting. Time. Daniel had understood it in a way most adults never did. Every moment mattered. Every breath counted. And now, Freddie felt that truth circling closer to his own life, whispering questions he could no longer ignore. He turned away from the mirror and walked into the living room, where sheet music lay scattered across the piano. He sat down slowly, resting his fingers on the keys without playing. Music had always been his escape, but now it demanded honesty. He thought about his body, about the exhaustion that no longer faded with rest, about the illnesses he brushed aside, about the nights he woke up sweating, heart racing, pretending it was nothing. For the first time, fear didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a warning. Later that day, during rehearsals, Brian noticed it again, the way Freddie paused more often, the way his laughter came a second too late. When the others left the room, Brian stayed behind. "You don't have to do everything alone," Brian said gently. Freddie smiled faintly. "I've built a career on doing exactly that." Brian didn't smile back. "You don't have to keep pretending." That word landed harder than Brian intended. Pretending. Freddie had pretended strength, pretended invincibility, pretended that life would always wait until tomorrow. Daniel had never had that luxury. And somehow, that truth had shattered Freddie's illusions. That night, Freddie went out alone. Not to party, not to be seen, just to walk. London buzzed around him, unaware, uncaring. Couples laughed. Taxis passed. Life continued relentlessly. He stopped in front of a hospital without realizing it. The lights inside glowed softly, steady and constant. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, breathing slowly. Inside those walls, Daniel had fought. Inside those walls, people faced truth every day. Freddie stepped inside. No one recognized him. Not without the lights. Not without the stage. He sat quietly in the waiting area, listening to distant footsteps, beeping machines, muffled voices. He felt small and strangely at peace. A nurse approached. "Are you all right?" Freddie nodded. "Yes, I just needed to sit." She smiled kindly and walked away. Freddie closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine the unthinkable. Not fame ending, not music fading, but him disappearing. The thought didn't terrify him the way he expected. What frightened him was something else entirely. Regret, the words he hadn't said, the truths he hadn't lived, the love he'd hidden behind bravado and performance. Daniel had lived honestly, even in fear. Freddie realized that bravery wasn't about denying mortality. It was about facing it with intention. Days later, Freddie made a decision. He called a doctor. Quietly, privately. The appointment was brief but heavy. Tests were ordered. Conversations were careful. Freddie joked. Of course he did. But when he left the office, the weight of inevitability followed him like a shadow. The results would take time. Waiting, Freddie discovered, was its own kind of torment. During those weeks, he wrote incessantly. Lyrics poured out, raw, direct, stripped of metaphor. Songs about time, about truth, about wanting to be remembered not as a god, but as a man who loved deeply. He visited hospitals again, sat with children, sang softly, never announced, never photographed. One afternoon, a young patient asked him, "Are you scared of dying?" Freddie paused. "Yes," he said honestly, "but I'm more scared of not living." The child smiled. That night, alone again, Freddie returned a mirror. He looked at himself, truly looked, and whispered something he had avoided his entire life. "I don't have forever." The words didn't break him. They freed him. When the phone finally rang with the doctor's request to come in, Freddie felt a strange calm settle over him. He dressed carefully, slowly, deliberately. As he stepped out the door, he carried Daniel's last letter in his pocket. A reminder, a promise, a truth. Freddie Mercury was about to hear words that would change everything. Not just how he lived, but how he would choose to be remembered. And this time, he wouldn't look away.